The afternoon air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made even the slightest movement feel like a chore. Dark clouds loomed overhead, threatening rain as Marcus Johnson walked home from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The 14-year-old had taken this route every day, cutting through a few side streets before reaching his neighborhood. It wasn't the best part of town, but it was home. Marcus was used to seeing broken-down cars on the side of the road, old beat-up sedans and rusted-out trucks, their owners frustrated as they tried to get them working again. But today, something was different. Up ahead, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz sat stranded on the curb, its hazard lights blinking. Even from a distance, Marcus could tell something was wrong. As he got closer, he spotted a man standing beside the car, pacing with his phone pressed to his ear. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that looked way too expensive for this part of town. The man ran a hand through his neatly combed silver hair, his frustration clear. Marcus slowed his steps, debating whether he should keep walking. His mother always warned him about getting involved in other people's business, especially with rich folks who might not take kindly to a kid like him approaching. But something about the way the man kept looking at his flat tire, shaking his head, made Marcus stop. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said, stepping onto the curb. "Do you need some help?" The man looked up from his phone, startled. His piercing blue eyes swept over Marcus, taking in his faded sneakers, scuffed jeans, and oversized hoodie. There was a flicker of hesitation in his gaze before he sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Unless you know how to change a tire, kid, I don't think there's much you can do," the man said. His tone wasn't exactly rude, but it wasn't friendly either. Marcus grinned. "Actually, I do." The man raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Marcus nodded. He'd spent enough time watching his uncle fix cars in their driveway to know the basics. He wasn't an expert, but he could handle a flat tire. "I can take a look," Marcus offered. The man hesitated again, then exhaled sharply. "You know what? Fine. Go ahead. The spare's in the trunk." Marcus walked around to the back of the car, where the man popped the trunk open with a click. Inside, neatly tucked away, was a spare tire and a small jack. Marcus rolled up his sleeves and got to work. As he loosened the lug nuts, the man watched him with cautious curiosity. "What's your name, kid?" "Marcus," he replied, adjusting the jack under the car. "Marcus Johnson." "Well, Marcus Johnson, I appreciate the help. I'm Richard Bennett." Marcus froze for a split second, his hands gripping the wrench. The name sounded familiar. He had heard it before. On the news, maybe? Or in one of those business magazines his school library stocked but no one ever read. "You're that Bennett?" Marcus asked, glancing up. Richard chuckled dryly. "I suppose so. You know who I am." Marcus shrugged, refocusing on the tire. "I think I've heard the name before. Something about business." Richard smirked. "Something like that." Marcus didn't press further. He wasn't the type to care about rich people's problems. What mattered now was getting the tire changed before the rain started. After a few more minutes of work, he tightened the last lug nut and wiped his hands on his jeans. "All done," he said, stepping back. Richard bent down, inspecting the job. To his surprise, it was done perfectly. The tire was secure, the bolts tightened properly, better than he expected from a teenager. Richard stood up, brushing off his suit. "You sure you're only 14? Marcus laughed. "Pretty sure." Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Here, kid. Take this." Marcus shook his head. "Nah, I don't need that." Richard frowned. "What do you mean? You helped me out. You deserve something for it." "I didn't do it for money," Marcus said simply. "Just figured you needed a hand." Richard studied Marcus for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. In all his years of business, he had met countless people. Some desperate for money, others willing to do anything for a favor. But this kid, he was different. Marcus slung his backpack back over his shoulder. "Anyway, I should get going. My mom's expecting me home." Richard watched as Marcus walked away, disappearing around the corner. He had never met a teenager quite like him. and something told him that this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths. Richard Bennett sat in his car for a long moment, watching as Marcus disappeared around the corner. His expensive leather seat felt unusually uncomfortable, and for the first time in a long while, he found himself at a loss for words. He had met countless people in his life, business moguls, politicians, investors, people who would have jumped at the opportunity to gain favor with him. And yet, a 14-year-old kid from a struggling neighborhood had just turned down a $100 bill without hesitation. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples before starting the car. He had meetings to attend, deals to close, people to impress. But something about that brief encounter lingered in his mind like an unfinished thought. That evening, Richard sat in his home office, staring at his laptop screen. The financial reports, emails, and investment summaries blurred together, his mind refusing to focus. Instead, all he could think about was Marcus Johnson. The way the boy had effortlessly changed the tire, the quiet confidence in his hands as he worked, the way he had shrugged off a $100 bill as if it meant nothing. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this kid's story. Without overthinking it, he pulled out his phone, called his assistant, and gave a simple instruction: find out who Marcus Johnson is. The next day, Richard's assistant sent over a file. It wasn't much, just basic information, but enough to paint a picture. Marcus lived with his single mother, Angela Johnson, in a small apartment complex in one of the lower-income areas of the city. She worked 2 jobs, one as a waitress at a diner, the other as a cleaning lady in an office building. Marcus was an only child, and despite the financial struggles, he was a straight-A student. But what caught Richard's attention the most was the note at the bottom of the report. Aspires to become a mechanical engineer, passion for fixing things, works on cars with his uncle on weekends. Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the desk. The kid wasn't just naturally good with cars. He had a dream that, given his circumstances, he might never get the chance to pursue. Richard knew what that was like. Few people realized that before he became the CEO of one of the most successful investment firms, he had grown up in a working-class family. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a school teacher. Money had always been tight, and if it weren't for a wealthy mentor who had seen potential in him, Richard might never have made it to where he was today. And now, he had the chance to be that person for Marcus. The question was, would Marcus accept it? That evening, Richard found himself pulling into a small, old-fashioned diner on the outskirts of the city. He had never been there before, but he had checked. Angela Johnson worked the evening shift here. As he stepped inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. The place was modest, nothing fancy, but it had a warmth to it. And then he saw her. Angela Johnson moved swiftly between tables, balancing a tray of food while smiling at customers. She looked exhausted, but kind. Her eyes filled with a quiet strength that reminded him of someone who had spent years putting others before herself. Richard waited until she had a free moment, then approached the counter. She turned, her friendly smile automatic. "Good evening, sir. What can I get you?" Richard hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Actually," he said, "I came here to talk about your son." Angela's smile faltered, her body stiffening slightly. "My son?" she asked, a hint of caution in her voice. Richard nodded. "Yes, Marcus. I met him yesterday when he helped me change a flat tire." Recognition flashed in Angela's eyes, followed by a mixture of relief and curiosity. "Oh yes, he mentioned something about that." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "That boy, always trying to help people." Richard smiled. "He's a good kid." Angela nodded proudly. "That he is." Then, after a moment, she added, "Is something wrong?" Richard quickly shook his head. No, quite the opposite, actually." He took a deep breath. "I want to help him." Angela's brows furrowed. "Help him?" Richard leaned against the counter. "Marcus told me he wants to be a mechanical engineer. I have resources, connections to some of the best schools, mentorship programs. I'd like to offer him an opportunity." Angela stared at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't want charity, Mr. Bennett," she said finally. Richard smiled. "Neither does Marcus. That's why I want to offer him a chance, not a handout." Angela remained silent for a long moment. Then softly, she asked, "What kind of chance?" Richard's smile grew, and as he began to explain his idea, Angela realized that her son's life was about to change forever. The morning sun had barely risen when Marcus heard a knock on the door. He sat up in bed, rubbing his tired eyes. It was Saturday, his one day to sleep in, but the knocking persisted, firm and deliberate. He heard his mother's voice murmuring something as she opened the door. Then, a moment later, "Marcus!" Angela's voice rang through the small apartment. "You need to come out here." Marcus frowned, stretching as he climbed out of bed. He pulled on a hoodie over his t-shirt and shuffled toward the front door, still half asleep. But the second he stepped into the living room, he froze. Standing just beyond the doorway, dressed in a sleek navy suit, was Richard Bennett. And behind him, parked in front of their apartment complex, was a shiny black luxury car. The kind that didn't belong in neighborhoods like this. Marcus blinked, suddenly wide awake. "Mr. Bennett?" he said, confused. "What are you doing here?" Richard smiled. "Good morning, Marcus." He glanced at Angela, who looked equally surprised, then back at the boy. "I came to talk to you. May I come in?" Angela hesitated for only a second before stepping aside. "Of course," she said. "Please, come in." Richard stepped inside, glancing around the modest apartment. It was small, but tidy, filled with warmth and little touches of love. A few family pictures on the wall, a tiny kitchen that smelled of fresh coffee, and a worn-out couch that had clearly seen years of use. Marcus sat down on the couch, still trying to process why a millionaire had shown up at his doorstep. Angela perched on the edge of a chair, folding her hands together. "So," she said carefully, "what brings you here, Mr. Bennett?" Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His expression was serious, yet kind. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "Marcus, yesterday I learned something important about you. You're smart, hardworking, and incredibly talented with mechanics. And most importantly, you have the kind of determination that's rare to find." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where this was going. Richard continued, "I know you want to be a mechanical engineer, and I know how hard it is for kids from neighborhoods like this to get the right opportunities." He paused, making sure Marcus was listening. "So, I want to help you." Marcus blinked. "Help me how?" Richard smiled. "I want to sponsor your education." Silence filled the room. Marcus stared at him. "Wait, you mean like, pay for my school?" Richard nodded. "Yes, I have connections with a prestigious private high school, a place where you can get the best education possible, with hands-on programs in engineering and mechanics. It's a school where students get access to internships, workshops, and mentorships with top engineers. If you want it, I can get you in. And I'll cover the tuition, the books, everything." Marcus felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Angela's eyes widened, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. "Mr. Bennett, this is too much," she said softly. "We can't accept something like this." Richard turned to her. "I know it sounds overwhelming," he admitted, "but this isn't charity. This is an investment in Marcus, in his future. I don't do this for just anyone, but I see something in your son. He has potential, and I want to help him reach it." Marcus's mind spun. A prestigious high school? A real chance to become an engineer? He had never even dared to dream this big. But then doubt crept in. "Why me?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Why would you do this for me? I'm just some kid who helped you with a flat tire." Richard smiled. "That's exactly why." Marcus frowned in confusion. Richard leaned back. "I meet people all the time, Marcus. People who only do things when they know there's something in it for them. But you helped me just because you could. You asked for nothing. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Marcus swallowed hard. He wasn't used to hearing things like that. Angela, still overwhelmed, turned to her son. "Marcus, baby, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," she whispered. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus hesitated, his heart pounding. The idea of leaving his current school, moving into a whole new environment, meeting students from wealthier families, it was terrifying. But then he thought about his dream. He thought about the nights he spent drawing car designs in his notebook, the hours tinkering with old bikes and engines, the way he lit up whenever he fixed something with his uncle. This was his shot, and he wasn't going to waste it. Marcus looked Richard in the eye and nodded. "I want this," he said firmly. Richard's smile grew. "Then it's yours." The rest of the morning was spent going over the details, applications, enrollment processes, scholarship paperwork. Richard assured them that everything would be taken care of, and that Marcus would have mentors and support along the way. Before leaving, Richard stood and shook Marcus's hand. "You have the talent, Marcus. Now you'll have the tools to use it," he said. Angela, still wiping away happy tears, pulled Richard into a quick hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means for us." Richard chuckled. "I think I do." As he stepped out of the apartment and back into his car, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A deep, genuine satisfaction. He had spent his life building businesses, making deals, growing his fortune. But today he had changed a life. And somehow that felt like the most important thing he had ever done. The years flew by faster than Marcus ever imagined. It felt like just yesterday he had been that 14-year-old kid, standing on the side of the road, helping a stranger change a flat tire. At the time, he had no idea that one small act of kindness would set him on a path that would change his life forever. But now, as he stood on stage, dressed in a cap and gown, facing a sea of proud families and graduates, he realized just how far he had come. Marcus adjusted the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been chosen as the valedictorian of his graduating class at MIT, one of the most prestigious engineering schools in the world. It was an honor he never expected, but one he had worked tirelessly to earn. Looking out into the audience, he saw his mother sitting in the front row, wiping tears from her eyes. She had always believed in him, even when times were tough, even when it seemed like the world was working against them. And beside her, wearing a sharp suit despite his graying hair, was Richard Bennett, the man who had taken a chance on him, the man who had changed everything. Marcus took a deep breath, smiled, and began his speech. 8 years ago, Marcus started, his voice clear and steady. "I was just a kid walking home from school, minding my own business." The audience grew quiet, drawn into his words. "I saw a man struggling with a flat tire. I could have walked past him. I could have thought, that's not my problem. But instead, I stopped to help." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, but Marcus continued. "That man was Richard Bennett, a man I didn't know at the time was a millionaire, a CEO, a person who could change my life. But that didn't matter. I didn't help him because of who he was. I helped him because that's how my mother raised me, to do good without expecting anything in return." Marcus turned slightly, making eye contact with Richard, who gave him a small, knowing smile. "That day," Marcus continued, "Mr. Bennett offered me an opportunity, one I could have never dreamed of. He got me into the best high school, mentored me, and opened doors I never thought I'd have access to. And today, because of that one small act of kindness, I stand before you as an MIT graduate in mechanical engineering." The audience erupted in applause, some even wiping away tears. But Marcus wasn't finished. Marcus waited for the applause to die down, then took another deep breath. "But this isn't just my story," he said. "This is a reminder that kindness matters, that small actions can lead to life-changing results. And because of that, I want to make sure that I'm not the last kid to get an opportunity like this." He turned to Richard again, his voice filled with emotion. "Mr. Bennett, you changed my life. And today, I want to continue what you started." Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Marcus smiled and addressed the crowd. "That's why I'm proud to announce the launch of the Marcus Johnson Scholarship Fund, a program dedicated to helping kids from underprivileged backgrounds who dream of becoming engineers, just like I did." The crowd gasped, followed by another wave of thunderous applause. Richard's eyes widened in surprise, but a slow smile spread across his face. He nodded, his pride evident. Angela, Marcus's mother, covered her mouth with her hands, overwhelmed with emotion. And Marcus? He had never felt more certain about anything in his life. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and families celebrated, Marcus found himself standing beside Richard, both of them watching the sunset over the campus. "You didn't have to do that," Richard said, his voice filled with admiration. Marcus chuckled. "Neither did you, but you did anyway." Richard nodded slowly, letting the moment sink in. "You've grown into an incredible man, Marcus," he said, "and I couldn't be prouder." Marcus smiled. "I learned from the best." Richard extended his hand, and Marcus shook it. But this time, it wasn't just gratitude that passed between them. It was legacy. It was a bond forged in kindness. It was the promise that one small act can change the world. And for Marcus, that world was just beginning. This isn't just a story about a boy helping a millionaire with a flat tire. It's a story about how kindness has the power to change lives. It's a reminder that small acts of generosity can create ripple effects bigger than we can ever imagine. And most importantly, it's proof that when you lift someone up, you're not just changing their future. You're creating a cycle of kindness that will continue for generations. Like and share this story to inspire others. Comment with your thoughts. Have you ever experienced an act of kindness that changed your life?